just in a quick thing, I wanted to just mention a lot of this sort of course of thought um, started because I was reading a book called Secularization of the Confessional State, The Political Thought of Christian Thomasius by Ian Hunter, who's done a lot of study of this time period, especially in Leipzig, and then started reading the original writings on Christian Thomasius and just noticed that in his desire to secularize um, Germany, Leipzig in particular, and that Saxony, he really did have a lot to say about Adiaphora. And that just began the question, what is the connection between the rise of secularization, the removal of eternal law, the basis of natural law and sociability, and what we do in the church? It came striking to me that there was a lot. And I'd also read the Kant work, A Religion Within the Limits of Pure Reason Alone, and saw a similar connection that it really wanted to get down to what do you do on a Sunday? And that the changes there are really connected to a larger understanding. And just in summary, I want to talk also just quickly about the concept of freedom. In the Thomistic understanding or the scholastic Lutheran understanding, freedom is really coming to terms with the eternal law, becoming part of that, where you're not standing in violence against your nature. And when you're free, you're going to freely and spontaneously do that which God has commanded to be done, which is being part of his divine providence, acting in accordance with that. With the secularized modernist view, which is I sort of summarized in the thought of Christian Thomasius and Immanuel Kant, but there's countless more, freedom becomes different, especially in Thomasius, where you just have the state and society ability is your sort of guide. Freedom is simply having no coercion in what decision you make. It now rests only in your will. You can will to do A or B, and that's freedom. That's a very different conception. That's the one, of course, we as Americans, the one we, supposedly like, and that's what our country is sort of based upon. But that conception is very different from the one that Thomas, Luther, and the Lutheran scholastics would have been familiar with. And that's another big shift as well, just simply the changing, either the removal of all metaphysics and transcendental thought, or the basing of that metaphysics and transcendental thought and reason, which in Kant would be a moral metaphysic as opposed to a idealistic metaphysic. So anyway, please questions. I know I'm saying a lot and look forward to it.
So we open it for Q&A for Father Coates. Anyone like to ask a question of Father Coates? Yeah, go ahead. This is John Mason, a Zion member.
So you had mentioned earlier, Father Coates, how we don't want to add anything to the Mass that wasn't there from the apostles or the early church fathers or was reached by unanimous consent from the church. It is my understanding that, historically speaking, public confession and absolution was not a part of the Mass. So I'm curious, how did our Lutheran fathers decide to add that?
So the question deals with the addition of public confession and absolution, confiteor, before the Mass, and where that came from if it isn't an apostolic tradition. Father?
I am not the best person to answer the historical question. Alberti talks about this, saying that certain areas, including sadly Sweden, but also the city of Strasbourg, did not practice private confession after the Reformation. Um, and I don't know where that came from, but I would agree if you're, using the principles we saw there from Balthasar Meissner, that would be an innovation that certainly in the form that we understand it today, and that's something to maybe ask a question about. And I think, yes, where Meissner was, private confession was very common.
Father Peace, would you like to answer that or make a comment?
I don't know if you're familiar with Fred Preck's essay on confession and absolution in Lutheran worship, history and practice. It's well done. It goes into a lot of history, and he points out that subsequent to the Reformation, as a result of the influence of pietism, rationalism in the Prussian Union that private confession and holy absolution dismissed. And this general confession and absolution was brought into the divine service and continued. If you want to read more about it, check out Fred Brecht, who is now in paradise with Jesus.
So because Adiaphora is connected with natural law, at least that's what, okay. Then what is the nature of its authority over the church? That's one question I maybe you answered that, but I just wanted to clarify.
So inasmuch as Father Coates showed that some of the fathers connected natural law with Adiaphora, the question is, what is the role then of that law and that Adiaphora in the church?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. I don't think I did get into that as in detail as I wanted to. Since, as we saw, Adiaphora is human law, but this is not human law that just does whatever it wants. It is, in a sense, ruled by natural law. Natural law does then provide a basis for understanding, what decorum is, what beauty is, what the good is, and also a very good understanding of how something is to be ordered to an end. And so we saw, very strong teleology in Balthasar Meissner's discussion of what the service is supposed to be like, that it's supposed to be ordered to the word and the sacrament. And, that's sort of then based on understanding of nature being ordered to its natural ends. And that's much different than the role that nature would play in a secularist or modernist understanding, where there it's determined by sociability or something else. So yeah, you want this natural, in a sense, integration of things to an ordered end. Um, and, and I do want to say, I am truly of the opinion that the Lutheran, yeah, I'll even say the common service as we understand it today, truly is a beautiful expression of proper understanding of adiaphora, and that one that was at one time much more commonly used, but sadly has been sort of fallen away with all sorts of alternatives and such. So,
And Father, go ahead, you had a question.
John Rooks from Shepherd of the Valley Lutheran Church in Perrysburg. Sort of follows up on the first question. The second category besides the apostles was their pious successors in the early centuries. When Meissner was writing in the 1600s, what did he consider the early centuries? How far did they go?
So the question is about the church fathers and what the dating of the early church fathers was according to Meissner in the 17th century?
yes.
Yeah.
To answer that, I'm going to turn to Meissner's student, Valentin Alberti, who actually goes into this in detail. Let me just find the passage. And it's basically up to through Gregory the Great. It's to the Pope, I forget the name, the one who declared himself universal bishop. That's the end. They have a very set period. He becomes Antichrist then, and it's all downhill from there. So, yeah, this is very much, and this actually goes back to writings from Magdeburg during the first Adiaphoristic controversy when they were doing that history. They had a very, very robust, basic understanding of where our good rights come from and not the bad. But yes, that is here somewhere. I'll find it. You can read it yourself too.
Is that Alberti?
I think so.
So page 10 is Alberti.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see. I did more. I started with him translating it, so I did more of this full translation. Oh, the completion of this era goes back to Boniface III. So that's on the top of 14. So up to the 7th century. So that's where the complete power or corruption is, and then it's over. So they do have a very set way of looking at that. And that seemed to be very common, Boniface. who was 2 popes after Gregory the Great.
We have Father Ziley and then Father Rowland and then Father Peterson. Did you have a question?
I did.
So let's go Father Ziley, Father Richard Ziley, St. John Taylor.
Thank you. I really appreciate your tracing the idea back to Aristotle, knowing where ideas come from. I think it's so enjoyable to be helpful. As I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, Adiaphora is like the law we have to keep to the right, which in England you'd keep to the left. There's no necessary reason why one or the other. But at the same time, if I were to say, this law doesn't bind my conscience, I can drive on the left if I want. Now I'm endangering people, and I'm rightly subject to authority for penalties. And I think that has to be emphasized because we sometimes use adiaphora as things that don't matter. And that encourages irresponsibility in the church. We need to be responsible as congregations to others in the fellowship. Just as we need to be responsible or accountable to one another within our congregation. So it's one thing to identify adiaphora as something that's not required by divine law, but it's quite another to say that we can ignore it or it's somehow less important.
So the model that Father Ziley presented, did everyone hear? It was the relationship between driving on the left and the right, and if one person decides to drive on the wrong side of the street, and then he brings this to the practice in the congregation. Is that a fair, restate it, Father Coates?
Yeah. Yes, and I agree with what you were saying, but I would maybe caution not to reduce it simply to the driving on the left or the right, which is an arbitrary rule for something that does not exist of itself. I mean, it's just driving. It's like measuring, and I use inches or the metric, and that's an artifice of man. This is actually, when we talk about the divine worship, we're talking about something that God has instituted, created, and how we deal with it and how we adorn it and such has more import. That's not arbitrary in any way, shape, which is sort of to go with what you were saying. I do think that, and I'm not saying you have this, but there is a reductive understanding that it doesn't matter in and of itself. And I'm sort of arguing that these decisions, these choices, what we as the church do does matter in and of itself, not for salvation, but it does have import for the reasons that we saw, in adorning and edifying and so forth. Yes, I don't want to moderate. Thank you.
Father Rowland.
Yes, I'd like to go back to a statement you made a couple minutes ago concerning the beauty of the, the common service. I thought maybe you could elaborate a little on what we have come to think of as or euphemistically maybe think of as the divine service. And I know in a Missouri Synod, there's probably 12 iterations at least that we can lay on the table. And you can go into one church and get one thing. You can go to another church, maybe 2 doors down a block, and not recognize it. It'd be completely different.
So Father Rowland asked that the idea of the common service be expounded upon and the difference in the churches in their use of liturgy.
Yes, I don't want to miss that. I did have some trepidation with this talk, and it's hard. To answer that, I was thinking about this as I was writing and putting this together, that I'm coming to Zion, which has a beautiful, majestic, but also, sui generis liturgy here. And I was also arguing a bit for uniformity, and I was thinking, oh, they're going to kick me out and say, oh, terrible person. And that was not my intention. And I do think that all of us, due to the fact that we didn't have much direction in what to do, all had to make best what we can. And we still are doing that. I think Zion has reached its, point of peace, and others of us are still marching down the way, trying to have a service that fulfills a proper use of Adiaphora. And I do, I mean, for one thing, just the rite itself, the common service as in TLH or such, was a very nice, way in which the Mass came down to us and was put together. And I thought that there's something good to that. Um, Other questions, I mean, and this gets into a lot of the hairier issues that I struggle with as a parish pastor. And exactly what collect to use, or even the question of Eucharistic prayer in general, and then which one to use. And that's very troublesome to me in a sense. And I don't want to just do something on my own authority. And I know Father Braden doesn't just do it on his own authority, but he received a right from the history of this parish. And I do think it's very much emphasized in all the writers that no one can make a change to Adiaphora on their own authority. And I think it's good if we could work to where we could, and I know even the editors of Gottesdienst with the calendar have tried to help put together something so we're not just guessing and, scratching our heads ourselves doing it, but trying to, as best we can in the state of affairs that we're in, bring order to where we have quite a bit of chaos. And I think that a conference like this, even though we don't come down completely on one side or the other, is very important to, I think, leading towards answering that very hard question of exactly what I think we all wanted uniformity, but what that looks like is very hard. And I'm so comfortable in my own peculiarities of my parish. That sort of bothers me too. So, and I guess, yeah.
We have two of our panel participants that want to ask questions. First, Father David Peterson, and then Father Renell Ackert both have questions. So, Father Peterson, you can
I'm gonna-
use this and I can hear you.
I'm going to ask two questions. Sorry. First of all, I wonder how uniformity has to be. And I wonder if maybe we're hearing it stricter than it really is possible or was meant by Meisner. You might respond to that. I don't know if you know. And the other questions related to that, on the bottom of page 9, Meisner says decorum is opposed to levity. I mean, I can't imagine in Wittenberg in 1649 that they had the clowns we have now. And I mean that literally, we have clowns. So what was the levity like? So what's the uniformity of uniformity and what's...
The uniformity, that question, I think would best, I agree that there's certainly not, every church has different amount of chancel steps and, where the altar rail and exactly, certain things that are determined by location. So it isn't complete and absolute uniformity because that is just impossible in different locations. So I do think it is more though than just, as we've heard in the Missouri Synod sometimes, of an ordo, which is just a reductive structure that has absolutely no content. And not that that's maybe that is what we need now. I'm not going to answer that question. I think that's too abstract to be helpful. I do think it was a set ritual, as in the written, and general ceremonial. It might not have been more. And again, a student of the church orders, which I'm not a student of the church orders, could probably answer this better. But I think, the amount of the ritual, say, like in the liturgy, the Lutheran liturgy for the Lutheran hymnal, had a full ritual and then very limited ceremonial. But I think that might have been as much as they had, that you lift up the paten, lift up the chalice, that sort of thing. But I don't even, but the elevation would have been prescribed in many locations, not everywhere, but in many locations.
Yeah.
Would you pass the mic to Father Eckert, if it'll go there? It may not reach, Father, you might have to get up. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for an outstanding presentation. I was intrigued, to say the least, maybe astounded would be a better word, to hear you say that Meisner was a receptionist. In spite of that fact, he defended the elevation. I mean, as far as I can tell, there's hardly a ritual in the church which bespeaks the real presence more than the elevation. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to expand on that.
Thank you, and I forgot your second question, but I'll get back to it. Sorry. Um, I'm glad you mentioned that because, and I think we've seen this even in the Missouri Synod, where our practice has often been better than our theology. And I mean, the reverence that they would show the reliquary, to make sure it was properly stored without thinking that it was, I mean, they thought it was, sort of holy. I mean, they have sort of a distinction in some of the writings. So, but still, it's not the body and blood of Christ, but they still treated it with reverence. I think that just goes to show you the importance of practice. And that, again, these things are not, without consequence when you change these. And when somebody does want to change them, they mean a lot when they're insisting that this change. Because these, Calvinizing people in Brandenburg, they knew what they were doing. They wanted to destroy the Lutheran faith. And they said, stop lifting it up. That's going to destroy it. Because eventually you're going to stop believing that it is anything at all. And then you can join us and, not even have the words of consecration, which they were doing in the Calvinist churches in Brandenburg at the time. There's just a shared meal, which is exactly what Kant wanted. I mean, it's just fascinating. There, the practice of the Calvinists basically lead to Kant, and the practice of the Lutherans is better than what they were teaching. So it really does matter. I know you hear this all the time, but what you do truly matters a great deal. But yeah, I don't know if that quite answers, but there is that. He's very traditional. As you can see, he saw that this is what we do. I'm not going to give it up just because it doesn't make sense to me.
So Father Peterson had a second question.
Yeah, the levity. What was the levity?
I would love to know. I just, I think we can have a very, well, for one thing, I was reading a book. It's an excellent book called Piety and Practice in Leipzig. Oh, I don't remember that. I have it in my hotel room. That's not helpful. But it's a new book that came out, and it talks about at this time, exactly at this time. And nobody shows up to mass until the cantata starts, because so they have the choir boys singing the Latin parts of the Kyrie and the Gloria in Excelsis, and it's all Latin, and nobody's there. It's just the choir boys and the clergy, and then people start waltzing in, and they're showing off their finery, just like today. I mean, and they're showing off. They go to their pews, which they have purchased, and they stop and talk to each other during the Mass as they're walking around. And they're sitting in certain locations to show off, and they bought different pews, and they decorate their pews in different ways. Way too much personal expression for a church. I mean, gosh, you go into some of these places, and they got their crests everywhere, and it's terrible. Sweden still has these things. So I wonder if it is mostly on the part of the people who are using this time for something very, earthly, and they're not being led by the liturgy, the building, and everything to the true worship of God. So that's, I think, part of it. Though I don't think it's levity in sermons, but there is a sense in which there is growing informality. That's also mentioned at that time, where I think, because pietism is kicking around a bit, and I don't know if that's quite it, but it could also be certain forms of music that are not churchly enough. I hope that's okay. Opera is a big topic. Hamburg basically says there can't be any more opera. I'm an opera fanatic, so what can I say? So that's sad. But they said that certain music was too operatic and that sort of thing. Handel, has to face with that in his time and so forth. So yes.
Yes, two books that come to mind in that connection. The one, I remember the title. I believe it's called Worship Wars in Early Lutheranism. It's, I think, written by a professor at...
Is it Hurl?
Joseph Hurl,
Yes.
right, exactly. And then there's also that little book. It was written by a Roman Catholic. It was published by CPH several years ago on the retention of Catholic ceremonial in early Lutheranism. Does anyone remember the title of that book?
Oh, I have.
Walter has a paper.
But in either one or both of those books, it speaks of how the people would just come in when the sermon began, and they'd run out after the sermon left, and that the beautiful choral service which went on, not many of the people were actually there for it. So there was this kind of thing. But I did have one or two comments to make. First of all, I'm not an authority on the 16th, 17th century church orders. I think we have some people here with us who are. But my impression is that within the area that a church order was prescribed for, say in Braunschweig, it was expected that the Lutheran clergy there would conduct the services according to that church order. Chemnitz, I believe, was at one time superintendent of Braunschweig.
He writes that in his Kirchenordnung.
Yes, and Chemnitz is Kirchenordnung. And so it wasn't as if every pastor was a law unto himself. The second comment I wanted to make is that being of a certain age, I can remember when the Lutheran hymnal was the book that was used in all our churches. And no matter where you went, from the most simple, least liturgical church to a parish like St. John's Mauger Street in Brooklyn, where there were vestments, bells, incense every Sunday, daily mass, all of that, it still was basically the rite of the Lutheran hymnal. And my own sense is, and others have said this too, is that it is desirable for a particular communion, confessional church body, to have a fixed text for the divine service, while the ceremonial and the music can vary. I think in the Missouri Synod that all came to an end, and people who remember all this correct me if I'm wrong. When the worship supplement was published in 1969, that had no less than 3 different forms of the Holy Eucharist. The first one was basically the common service. The second one was a horrendous thing. It was a liturgy that had been created at St. Mark's in the Bowery Episcopal Church in New York City. Very, very poor, barren thing. And then a third rite, which was fragments of this, that, and the other thing. But once that came in, we lost the fixed liturgy. And then, when the Lutheran worship was published, we also lost it there because there was an effort to keep the page 15 service, I would say an unsuccessful effort. And then these other 2 services that came out of the Lutheran Book of Worship. And this has continued. And ever since that time, we no longer have this agreed on text. The importance of the text is the doctrinal content. And it's interesting too, in the late 50s, Synod published 3 different musical settings for the common service. One was by Healy Willan, the distinguished Anglican church musician from Toronto. One was by Jan Bender. And the third one was edited by Father Carl Bergen, who was I would say, the authority on Gregorian chant, plain song in the Missouri Synod. He lived to be nearly 100, wonderful old gentleman. But Carl Bergen edited that. So by about 1960, you had the Lutheran hymnal setting, and you had these 3 too. But I'll try to stop right now. But I don't see how we can possibly recover an agreed on text. But I think the loss of that is a problem.
Father Charles and I have wonderful conversations over martinis in Baltimore. If you're ever in the area, you can come and join us. We'd love to have you.
We have somewhat comfortably moved into the meat of our roundtable discussion. And the roundtable has mics on the table, but they do not connect to the speakers. They connect to a recording device. So we'll have to pass the mic, and I apologize for that. I didn't warn Father Eckert that I was going to do this, but I'd like to seed our roundtable with a question. When Luther translates sola gratia, he says that the Pope and his minions stare at that one word sola like cows at a new gate. They don't know what to do with it. They're not sure how to get through it, or if it frightens them, or if it endangers them in some way. And there's been a new word that has been my new gate, and the word is propria. Now, our tagline, and when I say our, I include myself in that august group of the real editors of Gottesdienst, is Liturgia Divina Adiaphora non est. So, of course, we can say ra, and all agree. Now, it seems recently a new word has crept in, and this is my new gate, and it is Liturgia Divina Propria Adiaphora non est. And I'd like Father Eckert to talk about that, because I think it goes immediately to the point that Father Coates had made. And would you just touch on that for us? And again, I didn't warn Father, I apologize for that.
That's all right.
Yeah.
The slogan changed, I think about 6 or 7 years ago. We kept getting grief because people were telling us that's not grammatically correct. And then I'd explain, well, yes, it is. It's a little awkward, but it's correct. And then they'd say, oh, yeah, even John Nordling agreed that it was correct. So I figured we're pretty good authority there. But instead of taking all the grief in continuation, I asked Heath Curtis, Father Curtis, who is pretty much an authority on Latin, to help us come up with a better explanation for what we're talking about. So we have the new slogan, Liturgia Divina Adiaphoria
Liturgia Divina Propria
Propria
Adiaphora.
Adiaphoria non est.
Non est, yeah.
Non est. The idea being that indifference is not a property of the divine liturgy. So it's polemical, and it kind of gets at the heart of what we're upset about when people cry adiaphora all the time. They take that and they think it's a characteristic of the Holy Mass, which we say there's no way. That's the point.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Father Coates?
Can I address that topic too? This was another thing that crossed my mind, along with being here at Zion and the liturgy here, all this question. And I have always held before the change that when you were speaking of the liturgia, you're speaking of the work of God in the service, first and foremost. And that definitely is not an adiaphora. And I think, after what we've looked at today, we could see that that also includes the prayers that surround those works. That is not adiaphora, that they are done reverently and beautifully, according to the tradition of the church from its history, that is not adiaphora. And that is what is never something that we can question. When it gets into the details, and I guess hence the addition of the term propria, that is where, yes, there is, that sense of Christian liberty. But even there, we want to work towards as much uniformity as possible. That's sort of a summary of that. And I always appreciated the sentiment behind that thought. And so I like the original slogan too.
Thank you. So I'd like to open this up to the panel. If you would like to, I can just pass the mic to Father Eckert, make comments on what we've heard, and just go right down the panel and hear our participants discuss. Yeah, I'm sorry, that doesn't quite reach. We're taped down up here. That's natural law.
Well, I assume this to be more commenting on Father Coach's keynote.
As you wish, in the topic of modernity, adiaphora, and the divine liturgy.
Right. Well, one thing that crossed my mind as you were giving your presentation is the difference between Luther and Melanchthon, and that Luther's wheelhouse was more concerned about the, for lack of a better word, the isness of God. God is a certain way. He doesn't primarily act this way and that way, as Melanchthon liked to focus on, but that he is the way he is, and you can't talk about things being different than the way they are, because God is who he is. He is the God who is. He is I am. And Luther started with that basic point. And it sounds to me as though what you brought us to is, especially with this idea that the law is eternal, you brought us to that point. And I appreciate that important distinction because that helps us to understand when it comes to Adiaphora, why we do things the way we do them. It's not just that we're free to do what we want. We always are bound to the way God is and the way things are, and the fact that He is present here for us, and we must behave accordingly. There's not a question there.
No, that's perfect. Father Peace, would you like to? Thank you.
Two things. First of all, is Bishop Steckel still here? There he is, yeah. When we talk about the common service, page 15 in TLH, Bishop Patelko used to always say to us in the English district, now never forget that the common service was the gift of the English Synod to the Missouri Synod when the latter joined the former along with Lutheran Witness, correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So TLH, English District Heritage, page 15. That's my first point. Secondly, I'd like to, yay for the English District people. Love it. Secondly, I'm going to go a little off base here. I'd like Father Coates to reflect and comment upon, in our day and age, natural law within our society, our community, is being run roughshod over, a la abortion on demand, same-sex marriages. And I'm not sure that the church is able to give a good witness by simply saying, well, the Word of God teaches. Because these people have, many of them, no foundation in the Word of God and care little, if nothing. Could you say something to that effect? What's happening with natural law and its influence within our society?
Yes, thank you. And I think this will go along with what Father Eckert said and will be saying in his presentation as well. At this time, a lot of historians classify the dispute that led up to the period with Alberti and Thomasius as a dispute between essentialists and abolitionists. And basically, it's those who are interested in how things truly are and based in the mind of God. It's a divine, what it is. The others saw God at work, and it's very closely tied to the Via Moderna and nominalism in late medieval theology, which Luther reacted to very strongly, but didn't seem to be so troublesome to the humanism of Melanchthon, where everything's God, willed it to be, but it's not based in what the thing is, in the nature of the thing. So why is something good? Well, God willed it to be that way. Okay, that seems very pious and devout. God is willing it. But the other way, with that's the volitionist. The essentialist view, which is sort of the more Thomistic view, is that why is it good? Because that is how that thing participates in the very being of God, in the very nature of the thing. The goodness is based on what the thing is and how it is, not just willy-nilly. And once you start secularizing, the volitionist, you don't have any basis. It's just by your act of will. If the truth is just up here, I can now will to be something against my nature, which, I can say I'm a football player. That's not true. I'll probably die. But I mean, that's a sense where I feel like I can now. And with Kant talked about how, and then this gets crazier, where we start talking about how the things in our mind don't correspond to the things of the world. So I'm going to take my idea and through action shape the world into my image. And I think we see that, of course, everybody's thinking of, transgender issues of that sort. where we can shape reality into our understanding of what it's supposed to be. Kant didn't quite go that far because there was a universal reason, a practical reason that everyone participated in. But it certainly did sow the seeds to this more understanding of where we inform reality instead of reality informing us. And that's volitional. That's, again, based on my action, what I decide. That's what truth makes truth. And really, it goes down to the basic question of the Euthyphro, Plato's dialogue there. What makes something good?
How does the church witness in this context?
Yes, thank you. I think a big way is, again, and I'm just going to say it, the Mass is the best witness against this. Because there in the Mass, the truth of God and our Lord Jesus Christ is most clearly proclaimed in this world. When we are able to not only partake, but to confess in the Mass this truth, that is the best witness. I'm sorry, I don't know. For me, there is, and I know you could say, oh, there's lots of ceremonies and such. In the end of the day, there is really the one eternal Mass, and the one that is done. And I know we struggle over this, all the questions that we've been just talking about. But when we strive to, we as pastors and laity, to participate, when we strive to, say the Mass with the greatest possible reverence and directing to the sacrament, that is very important. And I know that's what keeps me grounded, the great truth that is right there before me as I face all the craziness of this world around me. And I hope any question of Adiaphora does not in any way bring into doubt the beauty and the validity and the certainty that we have in the sacrament of the altar, because I think that's very important. And I really do believe that it is in the Mass that we have to first and foremost fight against this, because that's how they first and foremost attacked the church.
Thank you, Father. I think Father Peace has a question.
I just say, so it very well may be that as the church gives her witness in and through the Mass, that witness is not received, and the church suffers under the cross.
Absolutely.
Amen.
I'm going to pass this to Father McLean. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like Father Peterson to get some time. Thank you.
I will try to be brief. I just would say that it strikes me that when we think about the civil authority and society, I think we pretty well have to agree that the day when we could expect society and the civil law to uphold that which can be known by the light of reason, by natural law, that is something that has disappeared. I think that's appalling, but I think that's the reality. And picking up on what Father Peace said, as long ago as 1968, when Herman Salsa wrote an article for the Australian Church on the issue of abortion, he made the point that long ago, 51 years ago, that the Constantinian era is over and that the church there's no longer that symphony between the church and the state and all of that. That's all over. And we are in the position of the church before Constantine. I had a question to ask of Father Coates, and that is, do these early Lutherans have anything to say about what should be done when within the church there is a disagreement as to what constitutes adiaphora? Because I think one of the problems we have, yes, in our synod today, is that we are not all agreed on what is and what is not Adiaphora?
Yes, and that is a good question. And Karpsov, I think the jurisprudence gentleman, talks most about this, that these questions have to be settled by the whole church. And again, we hear this all the time in Lutheran theology, the whole church issues a call and on and on. But it's an important thing that we talk about. They don't want it to be in the hands of any one man, which is what they see as papal tyranny. Um, but Karpsov goes on to say that it's an aristocracy, which then Tomasius calls him part of the Illuminati. So it's sort of a fun back and forth. But that the whole church that needs to come together. And he says that that's in through the representative church of the consistory of the territorial, so that the civil authority has no right at all to determine these things, but it has to be the better lights, hopefully the better lights, and that's of course always the problem, but hopefully the better lights of the church in that area. That's his simple answer, and he actually quotes from the Saxon church law where that would be addressed, and so in those passages. So that's his answer. And what does that mean for us today? That's a harder question since even in Missouri from, I guess, our earliest constitution, we're supposed to only use approved books and such. And that was, I think, not just suggested as later interpreters have come out in synodical publications, but that was truly meant simply, that's it. If you don't want to use those books, you can leave the synod. And that was never, hasn't been enforced for quite a while, and that's sort of a problem. But I don't know how to exactly with our present day, with the deep rancor and basically political divide that we face in the synod, how to easily overcome that. Because basically whoever is in the lead is going to determine, and that's not right. Because then Adiaphora should never be a political football where you bash one person and help another. And I'm afraid that would be the case if such power was wielded today. I don't want it to be the case. I wish we could, and we have the right. There's no reason that we as a synod cannot define this is what the right will be of our church. That's not an offense to Christian liberty. That's not offense, I don't even think, to our congregational piety. But right now, who is to determine that? Well, that's a scary question. So, yes, I want there to be a monarch, but I don't know who is supposed to be that monarch. I vote for Father Charles, but again, it's not an election.
Coates, would you pass that to Father Peterson?
Thank you. I found the presentation fascinating. I have a response here to Kant in particular, and into the way that he sort of sees the meaning of Holy Communion and Holy Baptism, but also to a lesser degree to I thought it was Meissner had that long list of this is what the elevation means. Yes. I think that a better way to conceive of ceremonies is not that we're having a ceremony that means something, but rather that the ceremony is a response to the reality. And anytime we try to add meaning to the sacrament, we've gone way astray. And I think that a lot of times that is actually the way that adiaphora is misused among us. They're trying to make something meaningful that, as soon as something has to be made meaningful, it's because it was meaningless. And so even in Meissner's thing, I think, but then the question, of course, is how do you decide what ceremonies to use if it's just a response? But then I think, piously, it's informed by tradition out of honor for our fathers. So I don't like it when people tell me that I'm high church, because I'm not high church. In my mind, at least, and maybe it's pure fantasy, but I'm just responding in a way that feels appropriate to what's happening in accordance with the tradition I've inherited in the space that I've been given. And that's not about meaning, if that makes sense.
Yes. So I can I think that's absolutely right. And I do think we in the today often are too caught up, and I've seen this in lists where they say, well, what determines Adiaphora to use? And it's edification as first and foremost, which is that meaning, it has to be catechetical.
Right.
That's the only rule left anymore, basically. And they forget about the decorum, which is all about piety before God. And at least Meisner had that. So you can never have one without the other to some degree. If you have decorum without edification, it could be so arcane. Is that really? I guess that's, or maybe, I don't know. But definitely you can see the danger of edification without decorum, where you have those services where they take time to tell you what's going on, and you're like, just let it. Jesus is there. You don't have to, say. And now we're going to respond because Jesus has entered the building, and and so I think decorum. It should be first and foremost. And decorum here, I mean the beautiful, the adornment of what God is doing. And I think he means well there, but I agree. I totally agree with your assessment that we don't want to do things. There's a time for symbolism, but that can't be first and foremost, just symbolism.